The latest American report on the F-35 is extraordinary. It was published by the US Government Accountability Office in June, and it shows that the situation of the aircraft is getting even worse. That means the rate of aircraft considered fit to carry out a single mission was 67 in 2021, and it's only 44 in 2025. Meanwhile, the proportion of aircraft fit for all expected missions has dropped from just 38 to a catastrophic 25, and all versions of the F-35 are now at least 35 points below the expected availability level to carry out all of their missions. And as my friend Bruno reminded us in a video on the subject that I encourage you to watch, the cost per degree Fahrenheit light hour for the aircraft has now skyrocketed to $53,000. It's a real disaster, and it makes it completely unaffordable for some of the countries that had planned to acquire it. And we've ended up in this situation because the United States pushed for an all F-35 approach. The goal was to have a single universal fleet all over the world with a single maintenance system, a single set of spare parts. Everyone would buy it so the costs would go down. And that wasn't just the Americans or propaganda or an attempt at a sales pitch. That was an analysis by the RAND Corporation. It's the American Research Center whose goal is to improve the decision-making process of the American military through research and strategic analysis. And in 2008, they actually published a document that explains why and how. We need to move toward an organization with as few systems as possible to provide commonality, which will allow for cost savings. This matches exactly the narrative surrounding the F-35 starting in the early 2000s. Since this aircraft is going to replace a number of other planes by being better and for exactly the same price as the planes it's supposed to replace. So many countries are doing what's necessary to move toward a fleet that will be made up only of F-35s. That's the case for Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Finland, or the Netherlands, which traditionally have only one type of aircraft. But other countries that until now combine several types of aircraft in their fleet will also follow this doctrine, with the goal of having only F-35s in order to save money. And that's the case, for example, with Australia, Canada, and of course the United States itself, which wanted its fleet to eventually consist only of F-35s and the successor to the F-22, a sixth-generation fighter that was called the NGAD at the time and that Trump named the F-47. And that's where we get to our triple problem. So the plane isn't up to the expected level because its technological ambitions were scaled back, quite simply because they were unattainable. I'll point you to the videos we've made on this topic. Its operating cost is simply unaffordable for a growing number of countries, including wealthy countries like Switzerland, the United States, and Norway. But on top of that, its availability is so low that the planned fleet size is insufficient to carry out even the minimum number of missions. And a growing number of countries have to buy more aircraft just to be able to do the bare minimum that was expected. And faced with this situation, there are two options. Either you buy more F-35s and enter a vicious financial cycle with an aircraft that flies too little for a very high cost, or you give up the concept of a single fleet and move towards maintaining two types of fighter jets at the same time. So, buying more F-35s? That was Germany's choice, which will be forced to acquire 8 to 15 additional aircraft, because the initial 35 units are considered insufficient to absorb the high maintenance cycles while still fulfilling their nuclear deterrence mission within NATO. And now that the Germans realize that even this new aircraft purchase still doesn't allow them to reach the required operational level, they're outright talking about doubling the necessary fleet. It's exactly the same thing for the Netherlands, because in a 2024 report, they highlight a lack of parts to keep the F-35s flying just to maintain the pilot's basic tactical skills. And the documents from the Court of Auditors also directly linked the purchase of additional aircraft to the need to ensure sufficient operational availability. And then there's also the United Kingdom, where parliamentary documents and statements from the Royal Air Force specify that, due to the low availability rate of the F-35 fleet, they would need to purchase 27 additional aircraft in order to have enough planes ready to fly and able to equip the 3 squadrons that had been planned. In short, you have countries going further down the wrong path by buying even more of a plane that costs them more, doesn't fly enough, and isn't up to standard. And then you have those who are questioning whether maybe they should back away from this concept of a monolithic single aircraft fleet. And those people have a strong argument: it's the RAND Corporation itself. Because in 2013 they published an incredible document in which they completely contradict their first study, explaining that the expected savings from a common aircraft for several services were cancelled out by the complexity caused by the divergent requirements. The title of the study is clear: Do joint fighter aircraft programs really save money? And they clearly say that, in theory, a joint program allows for sharing development costs, benefiting from economies of scale in production and reducing some support costs, especially common parts, maintenance, and so on. But after studying joint programs since the 1960s,
they conclude that this concept has never managed to reduce the total life cycle costs of a fighter jet, and they add that the JSF is not on a path that would allow the projected savings to be achieved.
and this is in 2013. What would they say today if they revisited this study? And on the operational side, they drive the point home even further by emphasizing that relying on a single platform increases the risk of grounding the entire fleet in case of a malfunction. That in this case, there are fewer options when facing an unexpected threat. And that overall, the concept offers less strategic resilience. So, to put it simply,
The overspecification, which was necessary to allow for a common platform for the three American armed forces, resulted in an aircraft so complex that it's even too expensive to operate just for the Air Force. Because of the complexities
we imposed on ourselves by wanting to make it an aircraft that was common to all the armed forces. And that, obviously, costs everyone. Fortunately, there are some countries that are starting to backtrack and question the concept of a single fleet.
just like Australia, which, after local studies by the ANO and the APSI, who used the term death spiral regarding the costs of the F-35, decided to reconsider their choice to buy 100 F-35s.
And so, the country revised its goal, and the budget for the last 24 F-35s was ultimately used to upgrade the F-18s.
Australia will therefore operate a dual F-18/F-35 fleet at least until 2040 at a lower cost and offering more flight hours than the originally planned single F-35 fleet. Meanwhile, the Australian Defence Association believes that upgrading the F-18s allows the country to maintain a proven strike capability, while being a lesser financial burden compared to switching to a fleet of 100 F-35s.
And this also allows Australia to consider joining the 6th generation fighter jet program, Tempest GCAP, which currently includes the British, Italians, and Japanese. And maybe Australia would want to join this program as well, so they have other ambitions than just depending on the Americans. But even the closest countries, when you look at, for example, Israel, they, for their part, signed a contract worth $8.58 billion to purchase 25 F-15IA fighter jets with an option for 25 more aircraft in December 2025, since the Institute for National Security Studies had concluded that a single fleet of F-35s would be financially unsustainable due to the maintenance costs per degree Fahrenheit light hour. And if we look at Japan,
For its part, the country decided at the beginning of the year to spend $1.4 billion to modernize its old 40-year-old F-15s rather than increasing the F-35 fleet as initially planned. And the National Institute for Defense Studies, which is the official think tank of the Japanese Ministry of Defense, confirms that maintaining a fleet of modernized F-15s helps avoid the budget depletion that a fleet of 100 F-35s would cause.
So, there are a lot of examples, but I'm still going to focus on the United States, which is the best one, and who are completely reversing course on their concept by starting to place orders again for so-called 4.5 generation aircraft, especially the F-15EX Eagle II, whose purchase price is still relatively similar to that of the F-35, but whose operating costs are so much lower today, it seems like a solution to avoid budgetary strain.
And Brigadier General Smith warned that the current U.S. Air Force fleet is already 37 years old on average and is aging so quickly.
That most of the budget is now spent just trying to keep the planes airworthy at the expense of modernizing them. And he added that in a few years, the very question of the United States' ability to keep their fleet airworthy would arise, not to mention staying relevant in the future. And the problem specifically with the F-35, it's that these modern planes, which are supposed to save money on maintenance, actually end up costing more than the planes they are replacing. So when the Americans replace their fleet, it costs them more and more, they burn through their resources even faster, and they have even less money to buy new aircraft. They're really stuck in a vicious cycle. And here you can see the figures for the flight costs of the different aircraft that are currently available on the market. This is taken from the video made by Bruno. And once again, I refer you to his full video, dedicated to the costs of the different aircraft available in the world, which is linked in the comments of this video. And all of this led to the leaders of the Air National Guard asking Congress to fund the purchase of 72 to 100 new fighters per year, including at least 48 F-35s and 24 F-15EXs. That is well beyond the current budget requests of the US Air Force, which has only planned to purchase 24 F-35s for the 2026 fiscal year, since the latest delivered aircraft no longer have any operational combat capability at all. And here we're coming to a major shift in American doctrine. It's what's called the high-low mix, which is the combination of very expensive aircraft for a few very specific missions.
With the F-35, alongside which they continue to operate the aircraft that carry out the vast majority of missions, the F-15EX for the Americans,
which allows for air superiority, the bomb truck role, and bombing all the daily missions, and then possibly a few F-35s. And once again, Ukraine proves that it's not necessarily essential to have this type of aircraft to carry out missions, including SEAD, meaning suppression of enemy air defenses. So this high-low mix is also becoming the norm in the United States. And all of this brings us to one last group of countries. Those who postpone making a decision on the grounds that having two small fighter fleets would be too expensive. This goes against the analysis of Japan, Israel, the USA, and Australia. But it's also contradicted by two other countries. We can consider them as small countries with small budgets. The first one, obviously, is Singapore, which operates only 20 F-35 and at the same time continues to buy F-15s. They explain that the aircraft are complementary and not interchangeable. And the second example, which I've already mentioned several times, is Greece. Greece is also buying 20 F-35s, and the rest of its fleet is mainly Rafale and also F-16s, which are reaching the end of their service life. So countries like Greece and Singapore can afford to have a dual fleet, considering that it's complementary and less expensive. But for countries like Switzerland, Denmark and others, in the end, for them, no two fleets just won't work.
Obviously, it's not possible for both to be right at the same time, and you know very well, given the example of other countries that have gone back on the concept of a fleet aircraft, you know who's right. And now, if we look at these countries, Canada, it's a real saga, because in 2010 the government conducted a study to estimate the cost of a fleet made up only of F-35s by comparing it to a mixed fleet.
But the problem is that this study was not published, and during a hearing at the House of Commons, the representative of Saab, who sells the Gripen, stated that a fleet of 65 Gripens would cost 50 million Canadian dollars to operate per year, compared to 250 to 300 million Canadian dollars per year for the planned 65 F-35s, which at the time seemed to be the estimate before the costs skyrocketed. And he also explains that a fleet of at least 24 Gripens in a Gripen F-35 mix would allow Canada to make significant savings. And in 2017, when the question of buying an all F-35 fleet started to be called into question in the country, the Canadian Defence Commission made a request to the government to have access to these analyses that were carried out, to be able to know exactly what it would cost, in addition to having a double fleet, and by 6 votes to 3. The government refuses to provide the Defence Commission with information that would allow them to make an informed choice based on data. They want to keep it secret. Politics imposes its choice on decision makers in defense matters, and that choice is purely political, but they refuse to reveal the figures. And that's something that is obviously unacceptable in a democracy. And it's not for nothing that, at the time, the Rafale and the Eurofighter, which was supposed to take part in the competition in Canada, both withdrew even before the competition began, because they knew perfectly well that the dice were loaded. And so today, Canada has officially ordered only 16 F-35s out of a planned target that is still 88 aircraft. But considering inflation, the cost of the aircraft, its poor availability, its lower operational level, its lack of sovereignty, and the poor relations between Canada and the USA, well, there have been major discussions again since March 2025 and the change of government to determine whether it's better to continue with only F-35s or to move towards a real industrial partnership with Sweden to be able to co-produce the Gripen directly in Canada and go further than the existing partnership. For example, with the Global Eye, this aircraft, which is a Canadian plane with a Swedish radar, is a real international operational success all over the world. Even France has bought it.
And they're producing locally, having a local assembly line in Canada, having a real industrial partnership between Sweden and Canada. That is an ambitious industrial and technological project that strengthens sovereignty in every way.
It's really the right solution. Now, as for Switzerland, let me remind you, in 2021, they chose the F-35 over the Rafale the Eurofighter and the F-18 Super Hornet, notably because in the Swiss evaluation, the F-35 was by far the cheapest aircraft over its entire life cycle.
And the goal was to buy 36 aircraft for about 6 billion Swiss francs in order to replace the F-18s and the F-5s.
Except that, a few years later, the economic miracle disappeared and the United States proposed a price increase. And Byrne discovers that the fixed price contract they had negotiated is actually not fixed price after all, and so the prices are going to increase. And the government is now requesting an additional funding of 394 million Swiss francs, just to be able to buy 30 planes instead of 36 more expensive ones, to have 6 fewer, which will fly less well, which will cost more per degree Fahrenheit light hour. That's But the most amazing thing is that Switzerland has just discovered that, well, the poor availability of the plane means that they will have to buy more than 30 aircraft. And what about Switzerland's actual operational needs? It wouldn't be to have 36 planes, but rather between 56 and 70 aircraft. And now, for the first time, Switzerland is reopening the door. That the future resources needed to reach this fleet of 55 to 70 aircraft would be studied, regardless of the type of aircraft. And that this consideration should take into account the duration of support, dependence on manufacturers, operational capabilities, and of course, budget constraints. So let's be clear. They will take the maximum number of F-35s they can buy with the budget that has already been decided and voted on. But for the future, there is an opening to bring other aircraft back into the competition. Why not the Rafale, which, I remind you, had won this competition until Joe Biden made a visit to Switzerland.
And at the time, I was working at Air EcoSport. We had received an email from the manufacturers confirming that the Rafale had won the competition. The Swiss military wanted it. The manufacturers had already approved it. Everyone was on the same page. It was a political choice. It wasn't a choice made by the military. So, will the Rafale come back into the competition? Could the Gripen come back into the competition? I remind you that in the 2008 competition, it was the Gripen that was chosen at the time. So, there are other options that might open up again, and maybe Switzerland won't make the mistake of continuing entirely with the F-35.
In that respect, I hope Switzerland will follow Canada's example.
And then there's one country, I haven't talked about it. Let me remind you that I'm Franco-Belgian, and the Franco-Belgians, the Belgians, what are they doing?
Well, they're the only ones who really understood, and for them, there are two issues. First, they realized that NATO, the United States, are forcing them to buy more planes. Because the fleet, as it is planned, doesn't allow Belgium to meet its obligations within NATO.
And so, the United States is asking Belgium to buy 21 more planes. And Air Force Colonel Roland van Tienen, who is the director of the F-35 program for Belgian defense, claims that there is no alternative offering as much air capability at this price, taking into account long-term costs and economies of scale. But if you're buying 21 planes all at once, then you could buy 21 planes from another category.
We saw it with Greece, with Singapore. They're not going to do that. The Belgians are great. They're just going to buy 11 planes, and indeed, you don't get a fleet of 11 planes from another category.
So they buy 11 planes first. Then you'll see that in a little while they'll buy another 10 planes. That way they'll never have made a purchase of 20 planes, which would make buying the Gripen or the Rafale relevant.
And in this way, they'll block the opposition, since there are indeed elected officials who are trying to reopen the discussion and ask the question, is it really worth continuing to buy F-35s?
But anyway, I'm sure the Americans will give us some very good arguments again, since they're transparent. The Americans, up until now, have at least acknowledged the problems with the F-35. They told us how much more expensive it was than expected, how it was less effective than expected, and how it flew less than expected, at least until early August.
On August 7th, we learned that the U.S. Department of Defense censored the next full report from the U.S. Government Accountability Office on the F-35.
They no longer want the truth to be known, just like in Canada. The studies weren't published because they would have bothered certain people, and it's the same in the United States. No, they no longer want their own public and the international public to really know where the F-35 stands. And that's a real problem today, this so-called transparency we had, which was already diminished compared to reality. I'll refer you to the videos we also made, Bruno, on this subject. We knew very well that the Americans were already becoming less and less transparent, with reports that were getting shorter and less technical, and in which, well, there was a growing gap between the ambitions and what we were actually able to achieve. And now we no longer have the information, so if we don't have the information anymore and the costs are rising, you can imagine that the situation is not getting any better, and it's only going to get worse tomorrow. So it's really urgent to make the right decisions. So those who speak French, those who are abroad, reduce as much as possible all the orders we have with the United States for the F-35 switch to alternative aircraft for the sake of our common European defense. To be able to buy as a sovereign European without relying on the goodwill of the United States. Incidentally, about this aircraft, to be able to launch enough aircraft to face the threat that Russia represents today, that's what's fundamental. There's no need to have stealth aircraft to face the Russians. Our Air Force, the Gripen, is superior to all the aircraft available in the Russian military. The Rafale is superior to Russian aircraft. The Ukrainians prove to us every day that they shoot down Sukhoi 35s with just F-16s, which are largely outclassed by the Rafale and by the Gripen and by the Eurofighter.
So we need to forget about American planes. As much as possible, tell your decision makers that you cannot accept this state of subservience for something that is expensive, not up to standard, and that ties your hands and feet.
tied to American decisions for decades and decades. Unfortunately, we can't work properly in Europe. But today it's time to say stop. Once again, it's time to say stop and to follow the good examples of the Americans when they try to back away from the single fleet concept.
And what if I told you that it's been more than 3 years since Lockheed Martin delivered over 400 F-35s and they have zero combat capability?
Would you believe me?
You'd have a hard time, right? Because this information is so unbelievable.
And yet,
It is true and described in several American reports that tell about other crazy things like this. And we understand why this year they censored a report. So I'm making a video with long readings of passages. It's a bit tedious, but if I didn't read these reports, you wouldn't believe what I'm telling you. So the video link is in the description.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you very soon.